Welcome to another installment of Defending Israel. I am your host, Rabbi Pinchas Landis. The whole world knows that the Palestinians have a claim to the land of Israel. But what exactly is that claim? In short, when the Jews started to return en masse to the land of Israel, they were already a majority in the land. So they have the right to self-determination. But does the right to self-determination mean that every family, tribe, and ethnic group has the right to an independent state? No, they must first develop into a people or a nation. Even under the most generous definition of nationhood, the Palestinians did not exist as a separate people until after 1967. Now, the relative youth of the Palestinians does not invalidate their claim, but it does limit the extent that their claim can be used against Israel. How can Israel be blamed for not recognizing a Palestinian people before the Palestinians themselves did so? Let's also not forget what we mentioned in the previous video, that at the turn of the 19th century, there were only between 100 and 250,000 people total in all of Palestine. Most of today's Palestinians' antecedents arrived at the same time the Jews started to return, albeit initially at a greater rate than the Jews, hence the large Arab population before 1948. Today, the Palestinians are a nation made up of millions of individuals. But before 1967, this nationhood had not trickled down to the average individual. Before World War I, Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire. During their rule, the land was never a distinct province. If anything, Palestine was viewed as southern Syria. Not only was there no group identifying themselves as Palestinians, but there was not even a group identifying themselves as Arabs. The residents simply saw themselves as Ottoman subjects. The concept of nationalism based on one's ethnicity or language did not start to percolate in the Arab world until the early 20th century. The famed Arab revolt against the Ottomans in World War I, led by Lawrence of Arabia, was a fringe movement. Most Arab-speaking Ottomans remained loyal to Istanbul, fought in the Ottoman army, and paid their taxes. After World War I, the Ottoman Empire ceased to exist and left a vacuum of many millions of people who had previously thought of themselves as Ottomans. Nationalism quickly filled this void. As the post-war negotiations dragged on, the Arabs of Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine held a Syrian Congress and crowned Prince Faisal as their king. But this experiment in Arab independence was short-lived, as the French and British mandates would soon take control of these lands. The mandates created borders which morphed into identities that had never existed before. So the first response to the mandates imposed on them was resistance. In January 1919, a group of Arab nationalists convened the first Palestinian Arab Congress in Jerusalem. They adopted a resolution which stated, "We consider Palestine nothing but part of Arab Syria. It has never been separated from it in any stage. We are tied to it by national, religious, linguistic, moral, economic, and geographic bonds." The first Arab nationalist newspaper was launched in Palestine that year. It was called Southern Syria. When they met in 1920, they emphasized it never occurred to the peoples of northern and coastal Syria that southern Syria, Palestine, is anything but part of Syria. They were part of the vote for Syrian independence. In 1919, the fact-finding King Crane Commission visited Palestine and concluded that a majority of the region's people wanted to be included in an independent Syria. After France squashed the short-lived Syrian kingdom, Palestine's Arabs found themselves severed from Syria. They did not create or welcome these new borders, but they eventually defined themselves by them. At the Third Palestine Arab Congress, it was determined, after the most recent events in Syria, we have to change our plans completely. Southern Syria does not exist. This was the beginning of Palestinian nationalism, but it would take many decades to capture the hearts and minds of the populace. Palestinian Arabs sought to stomp out the Jewish state before it was born, not because they wanted to form a Palestinian state, rather they just didn't want Jews taking control of what they perceived as Muslim lands. In classical Islamic law, there are three divisions of the entire world. Dar al-Islam, territories conquered by Islam. Dar al-Sula, territories of treaty where there is an armistice with Islam. And Dar al-Kharab, territories of war. Since Palestine was Dar al-Islam, it must remain that. It doesn't matter if it was originally conquered from the Romans who conquered it from the Jews and that the world was just trying to right that wrong. Doesn't matter. It's Islamic territory. After the United Nations Resolution 181 voted to partition Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state, a civil war broke out between the Arabs and Jews. Not because the Arabs wanted more territory for their state. They didn't want a state, but they also did not want the Jews to have a state. On May 15, 1948, when the British Mandate ended and Israel declared its independence, the fledgling country was attacked by Egypt, Syria, Transjordan, Iraq, and Lebanon for the same reason. At the end of the war, Egypt and Transjordan controlled most of the lands that the UN had earmarked for an Arab state, and for the next 20 years, no one talked about forming an independent Arab state on these lands, because they were controlled by Muslims, Dar al-Islam. After 1948, King Abdullah of Transjordan quickly annexed the lands he had conquered in the war and shortened the name of his kingdom to Jordan, as if to say his kingdom was no longer only Transjordan across the river, but now on both sides. Hence the term the West Bank. In 1950, many residents of the West Bank flocked to the polls in the Jordanian election, and residents of the West Bank would make up almost half of Jordan's parliament. Those Palestinians who were not content being loyal Jordanian subjects were drawn to the pan-Arab ideas of Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser, hoping for one large Arab kingdom, uninterrupted by a little Jewish state. In 1964, the Arab League created the Palestine Liberation Organization, and it was firmly controlled by Nasser for its first 4 years. The goal of the PLO was to free lands perceived as Arabs from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. Hence the genocidal chant still popular today, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." The pan-Arab rhetoric of Nasser that promised the destruction of Israel culminated in the Six-Day War in 1967, in which Israel crushed Egypt, Syria, Jordan, and Iraq. Israel was now left in control of territories 3 times her original size: the Gaza Strip and Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem from Jordan, and the Golan Heights from Syria. This dramatic defeat left the Arab residents of the former British Mandate over Palestine once again lacking definition. They were no longer Jordanian, Syrian, or Egyptian, and the decisive routing of Nasser shattered the dream of pan-Arabism. Palestinians now stopped waiting for other Arabs to liberate and adopt them. They would now take matters into their own hands, hence the proliferation of Palestinian nationalism. In summary, Israel is often accused of not recognizing the right of self-determination of its Arab residents, but those residents themselves weren't even sure what they wanted collectively until after 1967. In our next video, we will address the claims that Israel has stolen Arab lands and attempted to ethnically cleanse the Arabs from the country. I look forward to continuing with you then.